Governor Jan Brewer surprised Arizonans this week by saying she wants to use the Federal Affordable Care Act to expand Medicaid.
Today we were faced with this expansion that is something that the voters have already agreed to. They've already said that's what they want. They don't want people suffering without insurance.
The governor also said she wants to change the way schools are funded to institutionalize higher learning standards.
With performance-based rationale, those that improve, then they will get additional funding. If they don't, they won't.
Tonight, the governor's plans and reaction to them. It's Arizona Week.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support. Once again, your moderator, Michael Chiha.
Governor Brewer released her budget proposal today, planning for a big expansion of health care for the poor and a shift in how public education is funded. We spoke with her earlier in the week, asking first about Medicaid. You called for expansion of Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act to reach perhaps another 240,000 Arizonans without insurance now. What were the factors in you coming to that decision?
Well, this has been something that people have been talking about for a long time, and certainly during the difficult times in Arizona. After the voters had twice voted to expand Medicaid, we had to go in and we had to do some serious thinking about how we were going to balance our budget. So we put a whole placeholder on childless adults, and so through attrition, those people sort of fell off the access rolls. And so today we were faced with this expansion that is something that the voters have already agreed to. They've already said that's what they want. They don't want people suffering without insurance. Arizona can benefit by doing this when you look at the facts and the figures. We will be able to expand Medicaid, deliver good services, and it won't cost the taxpayers any money, none at all. We are already paying for these people that we're going to start serving through a hidden tax. By buying our insurance, we're paying for the uninsured that the hospitals provide services to, which amounts to millions and millions and millions of dollars.
So would you say this is a move of political pragmatism on your part? Is it an acknowledgement that government does have a role in trying to take care of people?
I think that it is pragmatic, that you have to look at the facts and the figures, do the math. Anybody can do the math, and it's a win-win. It's the right thing to do.
What kind of conversations have you had with legislators who may be reluctant to do this, including legislators here in Arizona who say they even have an obligation not to spend the federal government's money?
Well, again, let me answer that last question first. Not to spend the federal government's money. If we don't use it to benefit our citizens and our economy and our job growth and protect our hospitals from going bankrupt, some other state will. It's not going to reduce the federal deficit one penny.
Will the balance in the legislature that's changed since the election, still Republican majorities in both houses, but smaller Republican majorities, will that work to your advantage in this? Because Democrats could be expected to support this.
I think that with the tenor of everybody coming forward after the roughest of times that Arizona has faced, that everybody wants to be uplifting and they want to work together, and that's what I'm hopeful for. So, in regards to the percentages, it probably will be a little bit different, but I just want good elected officials doing the right things, getting the facts, and doing what they believe is best for their constituents. And I believe with Medicaid, they will come to the same conclusion that I did. I did not do this lightly. I took it under great deliberation and consideration, and as I expect that they will. But once I made up my mind, then I knew absolutely, as the governor of the state, and I govern, that this is the right thing to do, and that I will be committed to it. And doing the right thing doesn't always mean doing the easy thing, This should be easy, by the way, because it makes sense.
Arizona's match under this will be covered under your proposal by a provider tax, if you will, or a provider fee.
Right, an assessment.
And how will that work, and what buy-in do you have from the healthcare industry on that?
The Hospitals Association and the industry out there are very, very supportive of that. They will assess a bed tax on their facilities, and they will use that money to go to the federal government to get the federal match. And so $1 that they put in, we will receive 5 back, and they are in the understanding that they cannot pass that on to the patient.
Cannot pass it on to
Right.
patients. So it will come out of their profits?
Right.
What about nonprofit operations?
Well, I would assume that it would come out of their profits also. You know, this is something that will be debated in the legislature. You know, there's always things that are questioned, but at this point in time, I think everybody is probably assuming that they will pay it.
Is your plan an acknowledgement that health care provision is a public good that there's a public responsibility for?
I push back against Obama health care, but there you go again. Elections have consequences. President Obama was reelected and he has the Senate. I fought with other governors, taking it to the Supreme Court, and they upheld Obamacare. Obamacare is here. It is the law of the land, and we respect our court system. So we move on and we do the best that we can. We can do completely, our option is to not have a quality health care program here. We could do away with Medicaid. We could go back to the old county system, which I don't think people truly would ever want again. Or we can deliver the services, be the model for the country, bring $2 billion into our state, save the hospitals, create jobs, and do, again, what I believe is morally right, to take care of those people that need some help.
The Medicaid proposal seems to have taken many by surprise, with a mix of reactions from legislators and a representative of the healthcare industry. Give us your initial reaction to the governor's proposal for Medicaid.
Oh, elated. One of the reasons I ran is because of what's happening with healthcare to the working poor, to the poor citizens of Arizona. And so I was elated that she said she was willing to expand the Medicaid program.
It was a great sigh of relief and an excellent first step towards bringing some stability to our healthcare system that is sorely needed. And the impact of that will also have great positive effect on the business community as well, and for all Arizonans.
And we could say you're speaking for the healthcare industry in saying so, is that correct?
I believe the healthcare industry is unified in their support of this news, particularly the hospital industry. We really have to commend Governor Brewer in taking the time to think through this decision. We know it's not an easy one, and we know we have ways to go, but we are excited about the possibility of restoring Proposition 204 and expanding the Medicaid program.
Not particularly enthusiastic. I oppose the Medicaid expansion on a number of reasons. It certainly puts the state at risk of assuming an awfully large additional expense, which we can't afford. Now, I know the governor is proposing that it not impact the general fund because it would be a tax imposed on hospitals to pay for it. Beyond the fact that I oppose a tax, there's no guarantee that the money will keep flowing from Washington, and we expect the match to decrease in the coming years. I mean, they'll be pushing $20 trillion in national debt. That's unsustainable. They're going to have to back off. And the first thing they usually do when the feds back off is push expenses onto the states. And if that match were ever to go away, it could balloon the deficit in Arizona in 2016 to over $500 million. And we don't want to go back down that road.
Would there be any likelihood that the circuit breaker the governor calls the mechanism that allows a scaling back, should there be a federal scaling back, would that make it work?
Well, the circuit breaker would certainly remove the economic threat to the state of Arizona, but that's assuming that the federal government would agree to a circuit breaker. I don't think they would. That's a precedent that would apply nationwide, And when the feds finally had to back off on the match, which I think is inevitable, you could literally see half the states unwinding the expansion, which is the foundation of Obamacare. So I think that it's like the Hotel California. You can check in anytime, but you can't check out.
Any aspects of it that trouble you, that are things you think need to be modified?
Well, I don't quite agree, and I think most Democrats don't quite agree with the funding source and the bed taxes that might be added on from hospitals, and so I'm sure you'll get some response from the Hospital Association on that.
Provider fees are nothing foreign to the healthcare industry. While they may not be something that the everyday person talks about much in the healthcare industry, it's a commonly used mechanism that states have employed to help further expand their Medicaid programs, enhance reimbursement payments, and we see this as not uncharted territory, but something that is a viable solution and option to help, put into place the mechanism to restore the Medicaid program back to the Prop 204 coverage and the expansion.
And the governor's idea is that the industry would not be allowed to pass along those costs to patients. And the industry's feeling about that?
We think that's an important element. When we've discussed provider fees in the past and looked at these as options, I think it's critical that the patients aren't bearing the brunt of that. These are really designed to be an industry mechanism to help bring in some federal dollars, extra dollars, that will have a benefit to the patient, but also there is a benefit to the hospitals in having more people insured.
Do you think that the governor is going to prevail here in some way, shape, or form? Because she's already putting a lot of pressure on the legislature. She had a rally this week here at the Capitol to push this idea.
The one thing I learned here is not to try to predict what the legislature does. If it were just purely that issue, I would say the chances might be slim that it passes, but you never know what the governor might tie it to. This is like playing one of those three-dimensional chess games. There are moves coming from all directions. So I don't try to predict, what happens at the legislature.
The Republicans tend to be less favorable to these kinds of programs that help the poor and the need and the expansion and spending more money in those ways.
We hope to seek ultimately bipartisan and solid support behind the proposal. Thankfully, we've not seen anybody come out in strong opposition or speak publicly thus far since the governor made her announcement. So we believe that's an encouraging sign. What we need to do now is educate the legislators, bring them up to speed, make sure they're comfortable with the proposal, as well as the healthcare industry and the state as a whole.
Even if it doesn't cost Arizona a dime, we're all still we're all still citizens of the United States, and we'll be paying for this, out of the federal pocket. So it's going to cost us, although I think maybe our children and grandchildren, because the level of debt that this is going to increase in the federal government is nothing that's going to be repaid in our lifetime. So this is going to be paid for by future generations.
And there again, her rationale in regard to the argument you just made is that if Arizona doesn't take it, it'll go to other states. It won't reduce the federal deficit.
No, that's not true. If Arizona doesn't take it, they're not going to give additional matches to other states. If Arizona doesn't take it, it won't be spent, the federal debt won't be quite as high, and our children and grandchildren will pay it off a little bit earlier.
Educational reform has been one of Brewer's key agenda items for the last several years. As part of reform, this year she plans to reward performance by giving improving schools more money. You fairly consistently use the word accountability when referring to the public education system in Arizona. Would you describe what you mean by that as specifically as you can?
Well, we as taxpayers certainly send our hard-earned money into the public education systems here in Arizona, and it's usually done just by somebody doing a head count of who's at school that day, attendance-based funding. And I don't, it might serve us, and I'm not talking about getting rid of that, but I think we have to at this point in time, since I've implemented the core standards, that we realize that these kids need to have a higher standard, and we have said that they're going to be higher standards, and that we are going to be holding them accountable for improvements. And with performance-based rationale, those that improve, then they will get additional funding. If they don't, they won't. And I think that given that fact, that parents and teachers will strive harder because they know that they're making a huge difference. But, you know, we can't just sit back and say everything's okie dokie, everything is status quo. We're living in a very competitive world. We've got kids in school that are going to be graduating from high school, going to our universities, and they need to be able to compete on the global market.
Under a funding formula for schools that includes consideration of performance, what proportion of the funding would you see dedicated to performance and what proportion dedicated to attendance?
You know, as I release my budget, and people will probably have it soon, we will be able to share that with you. Today I'm not prepared to share that.
Would it be a significant amount? Would it be half, do you think?
You know, I would rather not comment than to be wrong, to set expectations high or low in that regards. But I will tell you this, it's a very, very important part of my agenda and of my policy making. And we certainly want to make it worthwhile and to make it sure that it has an impact. So we'll move in that direction, but I'm not going to quote a price.
How does performance-based funding for schools account for those schools that, by their nature or their location, low socioeconomic areas that we know traditionally underperform? How does it account for those?
Very, very simply. These kids have just as great minds as kids that maybe in a different school district. But the bottom line is that if you're here today, I want you here tomorrow. I don't care where you're going to school. If you're here today, then I want you up here. It's the improvement. I want improvement. They just can't be status quo. We've seen that for too long. I have been in office for 3 decades. That sounds like a long time. And I went to the legislature way back when because I was interested in education because of my children. And it was primarily the same issues that we're facing today. We want our teachers to teach. We want to reward those good teachers, but we want our children educated, and we can do it. And this is my opportunity, along with everyone that agrees with that philosophy, to come together. The parents have got to work harder, the kids have got to work harder, the teachers have got to work harder, and we will reward them.
Last year, you went to the legislature with a package of educational funding increases that they cut short of what you asked for. Specifically, the reading program for 3rd graders, they cut 20% out of it, gave you $40 million where you asked for $50 million. You asked for $100 million in what's called soft capital, computers, books in the classrooms, et cetera. They didn't give you any of that money. Will you renew those requests this year?
We will continue to see that our agenda is presented to the legislature, hopefully with a success. But I think that people have to understand that we always have to work together. That is the body of debate. That's where they deliberate these things. And you've got 90 elected officials down there representing 30 different districts that want 30 different things. So together we come together and we arrive at that budget that finally lands on my desk. And I'm willing to work in that process. That's what it's all about. But I think it's important that they understand what my priorities are, and that's why I released my budget, and I hope it's well received.
How much state money do you expect to propose being devoted to building up the school resource officer program as a school safety measure?
Well, and that's another very, very important cause that we have to pay a lot of attention to, because there's been so many different ideas of how we need to address the issue of school safety with our most precious resources. And certainly what happened at Sandy Hook Elementary was unimaginable. Terrible, terrible tragedy. And we've always had school resource officers in the schools. At least we funded for some of them in a lot of different schools, certainly here in Tucson and in Phoenix and in rural areas. And then because of the budget problems that Arizona faced, we had to cut that way back. So I think it's important that we have trained police officers or retired police officers on our schools. I'm not a big proponent of giving a principal a gun or a teacher. They're not there. They didn't want to become a marksman. They wanted to become a teacher.
A former teacher who's now a state legislator tells us what she thinks of the proposal, and we put a similar question to Representative Kavanaugh, who spelled out the state budget big picture from his vantage point as chair of the House Appropriations Committee. What is your initial reaction to the governor's proposal in education, that is to change the funding formula to include performance-based funding?
Well, my initial reaction was I hope she doesn't forget the underperforming districts that need additional resources. So hopefully tomorrow we'll find out in her budget if there is funding for those low-performing districts for extra resources.
Would you say that that'll be necessary to secure Democratic support for her proposal?
I believe so. I believe so. We haven't talked in detail about that specific area, but as a former educator, I know that, and as we all know, Arizona is suffering with our scores as far as education goes, and without targeting that population, and to be more specific, our Latino population, which is a growing, fast-growing population, we really need to put that priority on our agenda when it comes to education.
The general idea of performance-based funding for schools, is that a good idea?
You know, it is, because we do need to reward districts that are achieving. And, but at the same time, it goes hand in hand with providing good incentives to the underperforming districts as well.
As a former teacher, how do you see this change, if it comes about, affecting what goes on in the classroom?
You know, and that's a good question, because as a former teacher, there are some unfair pieces that go with this reform of hers, and that's, you know, how affected was the preceding teacher? And then you inherit these children that aren't up to par. So there's a lot of pieces to this particular part of reform that needs to be looked at, because there is some unfairness towards a well-performing teacher versus a not so well-performing teacher.
I think everybody supports performance funding. It's accountability, and it rewards good behavior, and I think that's great. The problem I have is that if we lose the lawsuit challenging the and/or in the inflation funding, we're going to have to give $80 million this year and twice that much next year and on back to education. And that's really you know, the general amount of money we were going to give in total. So the schools will probably get that money, but it won't be tied to enforcement and performance if, in fact, it's the court order that it just be inflation.
And what you're referring to is the appeals court decision that came just this week that says that the legislature has to provide inflation-adjusted money to the schools.
Every year it's 80 million on top of 80 million on top of 80 million. In fact, if in fact we lose when it goes to the Supreme Court, assuming that it's challenged, and I think it'll be appealed, if we lose, then without making a penny increase in the next 3 budget years, without raising anything other than formula spending, if we lose that lawsuit, we will have a deficit in 2016 of $340 million. And that's assuming that we don't increase any budget item other than formula increases that are in statute already.
What amount of money would you see being ideal to allocate to education this year as far as an increase over current funding goes?
It's hard to say at this time. I'll tell you the way I would like to approach the budget. Without voting any increases in, just doing the formula increases that are in statute, we are going to be increasing the budget by $152 million for next year.
Education budget?
No, the total budget, right? Total budget, and that's not counting the potential $80 million for the lawsuit, okay? So assuming that we win that or it's pushed off, all right, without doing anything, we've already added $152 million to next year's budget. I personally believe that we shouldn't add any more than $200 million on top of that. So my proposal would be that we create this $200 million box, and we have to stay in it. And then the discussion simply is, of the different competing wants and needs, how do we divide up that $200 million? And that'll give the state about a 5% spending increase, which frankly is reasonable and prudent in these tough times, because the recovery is very slow.
And the key competitors for that $200 million would be Child Protective Services, education, some aspects of health care. What else?
Employees wanting maybe a raise or a one-time boost in salary, public safety, the whole list, parks. So we would again have to figure a reasonable way to divide that money up.
Do we still need to restore basic educational funding before we go to performance-based, or as a part of it? How would that work?
Well, we really need both. We need both because so many areas, like you mentioned, have been cut. So we need to play catch up. And there's a lot of arguments there that funding doesn't contribute to student achievement. But my argument is, yes, funding does if the funding is targeted in the right areas.
What do you hold as the top priorities for funding in public schools in Arizona?
Well, there's several things. We have Common Core standards that are coming down the pipe. We have our park assessment, all these new reforms. And another one is Move On When Reading. So we need to make sure that there's funding for interventions for those kiddos heading towards third grade. Otherwise, they're not going to move on. We also have our data system to handle all these new reforms. And that's really important, to have an effective statewide data system to handle our assessments. So we can target the skills in our children to help them achieve.
A longer version of my interview with Brewer can be seen at azweek.com. The governor's budget proposal was released today after we recorded this program. So for details on it, go to our story online at azpm.org. For next Friday, we're seeking interviews with Arizona's U.S. Senators, John McCain and Jeff Flake. For Arizona Week, I'm Michael Chihak.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support.